Are you curious about the impact of multi-cloud when you're using Terraform? This video is for you. What's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, nedinthecloud.com, and welcome to another Terraform Tuesday. This week, we've got a special guest, Mark Tinderholt, who works over at Microsoft. He wrote a book called Mastering Terraform, and in it, he got into the nitty-gritty of what it means to deploy stuff using Terraform on multiple clouds. It's pretty interesting, and so I asked him to come on the show and expand on that idea, and that's what we're going to get into. Also, Mark and I are both going to HashiConf in October. More about that later. Well, Mark, welcome to Terraform Tuesday. I'm excited to have you here. And before we get into today's topic, you wrote a whole book. Can you tell me a little bit about the book?
Yeah, I did. I was one of those crazy people that wrote a book. I think we're in same company. I wrote a book. It's called Mastering Terraform, and I tried to infuse my principles, my philosophy into how I approach Terraform. And really, that's like to really be a master of Terraform, you have to understand the platforms and systems you're automating. And so actually a lot of the book is talking about multi-cloud architecture and
Hmm.
different cloud computing paradigms that are commonly used on those different cloud platforms. So yeah, I cover AWS, Azure, and GCP in the book with equal treatment. So
Wow, that's a little surprising because I know Azure Terraformer is kind of like your thing,
yeah, yeah.
and one would assume based off of that your book would be entirely about using Terraform with Azure, but that's not the case, right?
Correct. Yeah, I mean, prior to Microsoft, I was in consulting for 17 years, and so part of that, I had to be objective, right, and I had
Mhm.
to solve the customer's problem. So I encountered customers on different platforms, and as a result, kind of accumulated knowledge and of just using AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. And now at Microsoft, yeah, of course, my home cloud is Microsoft Azure. So yeah.
Right. I really like what you said that in order to get the most out of Terraform, you do have to understand the language and the way that Terraform works, but you really need to understand the platforms you're trying to configure with Terraform. So many times I will see people try to get started with Terraform and get frustrated, not because they don't know how to do something with Terraform, but because they don't understand the underlying architecture that they're trying to deploy. Have you run into that?
Absolutely, absolutely. People are like, "Oh, I'm gonna go learn Terraform. Like, I'm gonna go learn C# or Python." And it's like, well, what do you plan on doing with Terraform? Right? So,
Yeah, it doesn't abstract away the complexity that's in the different clouds, and that's a strength and also, I guess, maybe a drawback if you're looking for something that's just gonna be, "No, I just want to deploy a virtual machine, and I don't wanna understand the underlying bits and bloops and bytes of it."
right. Exactly.
So, when you were going through comparing and contrasting these 3 different primary clouds, the AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, what were some big differences you found between the 3 different clouds and how you have to interact with them when it comes to Terraform?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I mean, throughout my career, like, I've interacted with these providers, like, on kind of on a one-on-one basis, but when writing the book, I really had to, um, you know, work with them kind of side by side, right?
Mhm.
And so, in the book, you go through three solutions, basically the same solution, built and designed on the three different clouds, and you go through this migration process of going from IaaS to containers and Kubernetes to serverless with that solution on three clouds. And so I was literally kind of automating the same solution across those three clouds. So I really got the kind of visceral reaction of like switching from the different Terraform providers.
Right.
Um, and like each provider in Terraform, and many people don't realize this, is an independent piece of software, right? And so there's different design language, there's different, which of course kind of comes from the cloud itself, but also the authors of the provider kind of leave their fingerprints on like what the provider can do and how it was designed. And probably the biggest one, which kind of stands out, is when you set up the provider for the very first time. What context do you set that provider up in, right? And with AWS, right, you set it up with an account and with a region,
Hmm.
and you're kind of scoped to the region. If you want to do multi-region, you need a couple of providers.
Right.
Um, with Azure, you're scoped to a subscription, um, and that's it, right? And you can do multi-region stuff within one provider block. It's only when you run into multi-subscription deployments, which you need multiple provider blocks.
Right.
But then Google Cloud, it's like this even more flexible thing where Google Cloud has like projects like Azure has resource groups, which are kind of like logical um, RBAC boundary, for the resources that you provision.
Hmm.
But when you configure the provider, that thing's optional, right? Which allows you to do, I'm going to correlate this to Azure, right? Like it allows you to do kind of multi-region and multi-subscription deployments, if that makes sense. Like you can deploy
Right.
across multiple projects, which is gives the author of the Terraform code base a lot more flexibility and control about how you want to use the provider, which is pretty cool. But definitely shows how some of those constraints can influence the design of like the actual environment modules that people deploy.
Yeah, especially when you're working with modules and you need to pass multiple instances of the provider to the child module that you're invoking. Um, Terraform's gotten better about that, but that used to be a bit of a mess.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, especially on the AWS side. But yeah, I mean, where it's more common, I guess. But yeah,
Yeah. And an interesting, very recent change on the Azure RM provider with version 4 is you now have to specify a subscription for each provider. And that was always the case when you were using authentication types that weren't the Azure CLI. But now, if even if you're using the Azure CLI, it won't inherit the subscription you've selected from the CLI. You actually have to explicitly set it through an environment variable or in the provider block.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I that I don't know if it changes day to day that much. It just makes it like there are some resources you can provision in Azure RM that are like at the, I'm dropping in a bicep, but like at a different targeting scope, like at the like management group scope. You
Sure.
can provision management groups with the Azure RM provider, which kind of oddly would not be provisioned within the context of a subscription.
Right.
Um, so the the whole subscription requirement's always been a little bit tongue in cheek, but for the most part, pretty much everything is going to be scoped within the context of a subscription. Um, the AZ API provider, and maybe this is true with the AWS Cloud CC provider. I don't know if that. I just recently, hosted a speaker at the Columbus Hug who talked about the Cloud CC provider, but we didn't get into this detail. But I wasn't. Maybe the Cloud CC provider breaks down the same barrier in that, like maybe you can do multi-region with it. I'm not sure. Maybe it's still scope to it, but the Azure AZ API provider, um, does not have such a constraint. So people that want to do multi-subscription deployments, are like, let's say you want to blow out, the same deployment across a bunch of subscriptions, you can drop the same resource group across those subscriptions. They're doing that with the AZ API provider. Even though the resources are supported in Azure RM, the constraint of, the subscription scoping prevents them from doing so.
Right. Well, who knows? Maybe in major version 5, they'll change that and allow you to specify subscription at the resource level.
I would love that, because when working with the Google Cloud provider, it really reminded me of like, oh wow, this would be really nice if I had this in the Azure RM provider. But
Yeah. So comparing the different approaches to specifying stuff for the provider, was there one that you found you preferred above all?
I mean that I don't want to get in trouble or anything, but um, I definitely I like the flexibility, for the author to make the decision themselves.
Hmm.
Um, so I do feel like the Azure and the Google Cloud approach does give you that flexibility of like, do I, what do I want to deploy here, without adding a bunch of kind of cumbersomeness on top of that. However, with that power comes great responsibility, right? So you got to think about blast radius. You got to think about like maintainability of this long term. So it doesn't come without trade offs. I mean, that's true for anything, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Another big difference that I'm aware of when it comes to the architecture of the various clouds is the way that they handle networking, especially like VPC slash VNets. What did you find was different about constructing them when it came to working with Terraform and doing the networking that was behind the, I guess, the IaaS example for your book?
Yeah, I mean, the network's kind of the foundation of the house, right? So
Right.
even if you're like carving out like a little network space just for your little application and you're not responsible for like an enterprise vwan, it's something to consider. Azure and AWS are almost like buddies. They look very similar. The only difference was the hard scoping of subnets within AWS to the AZ.
Hmm.
um, but Azure, the subnets are regional, but you can like the compute resources provisioned within them, you then scope to an AZ if you're in an AZ supported region.
Right.
Um, Google Cloud is like a little bit weird, right? Like they have their networks are inherently global, and they don't even have like they're going their own way. They don't even use the subnet terminology. It's called a
Hmm.
subnetwork. And me not being a network guy, like does that mean anything? Like, is a subnet different from a subnetwork? I don't know, but um, their sub networks are regional like Azure's, but because they're tied together through a global parent network, it's
Hmm.
almost like they're creating kind of a global. Like on Azure, we have the VWAN, right, which is kind of creating that global network. But it's like a VWAN without the VWAN, so kind of it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I will say when I started working with Google Cloud and I was already very familiar with Azure and AWS, networking is the thing that really threw me at first because of where the way that the subnetting is done or the subnetworks, and also the way that you implement firewall rules,
Yeah,
very different than what I was
right.
used to. So it was those two things I really tripped over the first time I tried to deploy something in Google Cloud. And then once I learned the lingo and also like the Google brain way of doing it, you can very much see like this is how Google probably builds their networks, so that Google Cloud just inherited the way that they build their networks.
Yeah, no, total. That's a great point. Like the network rules. It's like you kind of have to pick your point. It's almost like Goldilocks, right? It's like AWS. It's like whoop, and some people like that. That's their jam. They're just like, yes, I want like to control everything, and like have all the things. Internet gateway, like NATs and like ACLs and SGs and all this stuff, right? And then like Google Cloud's almost like way simpler, right? It's just like
Mhm.
much different philosophy on how to handle that, and you kind of have to. I think ultimately they do the same thing. It's just um, what what the what box they come in, I guess.
HashiConf is coming this October to Boston, and I really hope that you'll join me there. I'll be presenting a panel on best practices for module design, hosting subject matter experts who have contributed to the development of some of the most popular modules on the public registry. What I love most about HashiConf is the scale of the event. It's bigger than your average user group, but it's small enough to feel intimate. With a projected attendance of 1,200 people, you won't get lost in the shuffle, overwhelmed by massive crowds, or find yourself walking for hours between session halls. Instead, you'll find a tight knit community of like minded individuals who are looking to share and learn about all things cloud and DevOps. Every time I go to HashiConf, I come back feeling refreshed and full of new ideas that I want to go out and implement. Whether you're looking to network with other professionals, reconnect with the Hug community, or learn about the latest developments in Terraform or Vault, I hope that I'll see you October 14th through the 16th in Boston for HashiConf 2024. And the other big thing that tripped me up between the three different clouds is none of them use the same uh, identity and access management solution, which it has frustrated me to no end. And I get it. Like, each of them has their own homegrown way of doing it, but it would be so nice if there was just like one global standard for how policies are structured and how permissions are granted and stuff. I assume you had to deal with that a lot when you were working with the three different clouds as well.
Absolutely, and it manifests differently on each cloud. Of course, some are more verbose than
Mhm.
others. Like honestly, I feel like the serverless solution on AWS was almost nothing but IAM policy. I mean, it was like what am I provisioning here? It's like just IAM, like I am this, I am
Yeah.
that. Um, so yeah, like the mechanics of them are different as well, right? Like the with and I feel like Google Cloud and Azure are more closely related um, in this aspect, which they're almost like buddies or brothers. Whereas AWS is very different with their whole the policy definitions and um, I mean, in the book, I do a lot of comparison of the nouns, like the I am role and, the service principle and things like that, between the different clouds to help kind of correlate the concepts. But um, when you get into the mechanics of the actual Terraform coding, it's just interesting, like rolling a bunch of IAM policy documents, and then linking them to roles. It's different than creating role assignments, with your managed identities. And I feel like Google Cloud is more similar to Azure in that regard. But maybe it's just like I'm more familiar with the built-in policy, the built-in role definitions of Azure. I almost dropped some AWS lingo there, but and I feel like I'm writing more custom policies with AWS. So maybe that's a me thing. I don't know.
I do find that the policies or the roles that are pre-configured in Azure are a little easier to discover. And I don't know if that's a result of the way the UI is set up or just their naming convention or whatever it is, but I find it's easier to, hey, there's an existing role I can just use as opposed to building a custom one. Whereas in AWS, I might spend half the time searching for that role, give up and just write the role myself because I'm like, I think I know what actions it should be allowed. I also find that the way that the policy is written, like the actual verbs and language inside the policy, uh, Azure feels more straightforward to me, but I think that's because it mirrors policies or at least like roles that I had configured for other Microsoft solutions.
Mm,
So it's that I have that lineage and that commonality that I'm drawing on. I'm like, oh, okay, I understand how you're approaching this language. Whereas AWS is using a different policy language that doesn't feel as familiar or friendly to me.
mm. Yeah. I feel the same, and I I I I definitely think the discoverability has something to do with it, and because I'm sure if I had to go through the pain of writing custom, role definitions for every thing I need to do, I'd probably be, saying the same thing, about
Yeah.
Azure versus AWS. But
There's definitely times that I've found writing a custom role actually does make sense though in Azure land. When I was putting together a module for deploying Azure storage accounts for holding Terraform state, and I really wanted to scope down the permissions that a service principal would have to edit state, you can get super granular, but there's no built-in policy or role that does that. So you'd have to kind of write your own to get
absolutely.
there. But once again, I didn't find that super difficult because I was able to configure the permissions through the UI and then just look at the configured permissions that were granted and then kind of almost copy and paste them into Terraform, and it mostly works.
Yep. Yep.
Cool. So, yeah, I am big thing to look out for if you're trying to work across clouds. Were there any big surprises when you were working with the different clouds? Something that you didn't know or didn't think about before until you actually had the 3 in front of you and you're like, "Oh, this is weird."
Well, I mean, I full disclosure, I've spent most of my time working with AWS and Azure, so Google Cloud is a little bit of a tertiary skill set for me. But um, when, like with this book, it really brought back a lot of my memories and things, and like I guess this one kind of fell into the recesses of my brain. But enabling APIs in Google Cloud is like a
Yes.
it's a big thing. It's like it's
Mhm.
like a bar mitzvah or something. Like you start a project and it's like you got to enable the APIs, and that's if you click ops the projects, you're probably enabling the APIs through the portal or the console.
Mhm.
But yeah, I can't do that. I got to terraform
Yeah.
those API enabled. So that was just like, man, just I almost felt like I was being hazed. Like uh, really, like I have to enable this API. But AWS and Azure, I mean, Azure definitely has the same thing with the RPs, the Azure resource providers, but
Mhm.
most of those are enabled by default. Um, unless you're using like more exotic ones, I'd say. But um,
Yeah. That's only bit me a few times when it was a more esoteric one that you don't typically use. If I was just using the standard ones to provision networking or compute or storage, those were all enabled. But then I would try to do something weird with I was just working on one. I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was like container app insights or something.
mm,
And that RP was not registered. And I had to go and register it before I could make use of it. Which is fine, it wasn't a big deal, but that's the sort of thing that you would wanna have baked into your Terraform, files. So if you're working with a fresh subscription, it enables that resource provider by default, which is a big behavior change in version 4. I don't know if we wanna get into that a little bit, but that's definitely something that has changed between, version 3 and version 4 of the Azure RM provider.
yeah, they make that a lot easier now. And that's one of the cooler features because it is one of those things that's not super um, what is it, idempotent, right? Where it's like
Mhm.
enable this RP, and if it's already like I've run into that. I mean, it should be idempotent, but I've run into the situation where I register it, but then I rerun apply, and it's already registered, and it gets really mad at me. So I appreciate that they're like fixing that. So
Yeah, and I like that it's more granular now. It's before it was on or off. Either Azure, which not Azure, Terraform would try to register like 68 providers
yeah,
in the subscription, whether you needed all of them or not. Kind of like everything's on. I guess that's how AWS doesn't even have an on or off unless you're blocking a specific service type. But yeah, it would try to register all of them or none of them, and there was no, like, middle ground there, and
right.
now I think you can specify a subset of them, a predefined subset, and then you can also list out specific additional ones you want registered if they're not part of that predefined set.
Yeah. Yeah. Core, extended, and then they have the ones that they used to register under legacy. Sounds like a good video that somebody should
Ooh,
make.
there might be I feel like you already have a video about the the 4.0,
Oh, but
uh
I didn't go into like what's in core, what's in extended. Actually, I've gotten some questions about that on the Azure Terraformer Discord. So
okay.
it'd be an interesting. Yeah, I haven't even cracked it open, but yeah,
They are there's no document to point people at other than the actual code page that has the list that's in Go. That might be a nice thing to extract that into a doc that's a little easier to read and is maintained. Seems like that's like a weekend project to automate that with a GitHub action or something.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So that was some very interesting differences between the way that you would have to think about crafting your Terraform as you're working with these three different clouds. And like you said, that's something you're doing in the book, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we follow kind of this fictional executive who's creating this new product, and he makes certain decisions that causes you know rapid change for his team, like shifting directions, because that never happens in IT, right? Like an executive doesn't have coffee at some conference and come back with total change in direction. That never happens. But
Oh.
so that's what we do, is like the three different paradigms: virtual machines or IaaS, containers with Kubernetes, managed Kubernetes, um, and serverless, which is where for the most part, like the IaaS and the Kubernetes based solutions, there's a lot of commonality, but when you get into the serverless aspect, there's kind of a bifurcation between the different cloud platforms.
Yeah, that's not terribly surprising since serverless was sort of the last on the scene out of those 3, and there was no standardized sort of open source project that all of the major clouds were following. They all kind of baked their own thing in-house.
Yeah.
Uh, I shouldn't say that it was last on the scene because I think Google App Runner came before, GKE, but regardless,
Mm.
it was one of those things where it was something that was just kinda cooked up in-house in all 3.
Yeah.
And so they took wildly different approaches in some cases, and what you ended up with is an inconsistent deployment pattern as opposed to virtual machines, which are pretty standardized, and Kubernetes, which is very standardized since it's an open source project that they're trying to follow. So I could see that, yeah, you could definitely trip over your own feet if you're not paying attention.
Yep. And it's also a place where the application code has to change a lot.
Oh,
Where
yeah.
in the first two paradigms, right? Like it's the same application code.
Mhm,
We just have to kind of massage the Packer template a bit, or massage the container image a bit, or massage the Kubernetes configurations.
mhm.
Um, yeah. Oh, that's another thing. I use the Kubernetes and Helm Terraform providers. So
Okay.
that's interesting. It might be a little bit controversial too, but um, I thought, what the hey, put
I
this put
wouldn't
this
say
down
too
on paper.
controversial. I know a lot of folks who at least use those to bootstrap the cluster before they use something like Flux or Argo to do the actual application deployment and maintenance. But if you don't want to go that full Flux or Argo route, then there's nothing wrong with using Terraform to do the app deployment.
Yeah, yeah. On AKS, I completely agree. Like, there's certain resources that, like in Kubernetes resources that are just kind of middleware that just like
Mhm.
connect the cluster to the cloud platform it's hosted on.
Right.
So in my mind, that's fair game.
Yeah.
But after writing the book and like really dousing myself in Kubernetes and Helm, like I love the Helm provider. Like it makes perfect sense. You're just using Helm CLI anyway, so you're replacing a Helm CLI, and then like the Kubernetes provider, it's like if nobody's authored a Helm chart for you, right? It's kind of nice to kind of dynamically provision like whatever Kubernetes manifests you have.
Right.
Um, but as opposed to like going and if you don't want to go deal with the Go templating syntax of writing your own Helm chart, it's pretty simple. But
Well, Mark, if people are interested, they want to know more about the book, where should they go to read more or maybe buy that book?
the book's for sale on Amazon.com, and also directly through the publisher, Packet Publishing.
Okay.
So I'm sure we could probably give them links to that, or
I'll throw one down in the description for sure.
yeah, yeah.
And if people want to catch up with you, you mentioned the Discord. where can they find out more about that?
Yeah, I publish it on my the Azure Terraformer LinkedIn page, so they can go check that out and join the Discord. We got channels. It's kind of like my channel, which is Azure and Terraform centric, but we talk about all the tangential stuff. So GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps, like Ansible, Kubernetes. So basically, a broader ecosystem around, Azure Terraform. And so you can get into all sorts of, different conversations with other people that are using Azure and Terraform. So
All right. Awesome. Well, Mark Tinderholt, thank you so much for being a guest on Terraform Tuesday.
thank you for having me, Ned. Really appreciate it.
That is going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. I really do recommend going out and picking up Mark's book. It is excellent. And hey, if you find this channel excellent, why not like and subscribe? I would definitely appreciate it. Until next time, keep calm and terraform on.